Okay, great. All right, so welcome to our September IRP Roundtable meeting. I'm just going to open my chat. Okay. So this slide shows our meeting logistics. If you're here already, you probably don't need this slide, but you do have this link to the electronic version of the presentation. That's where you can find this after the meeting. And right now, it's also online. Just a reminder that your Teams will work best in Microsoft Edge or Google Chrome. So if you have those browsers, those are the best options. Here is our participation slide. It looks a little bit different today, but it's the same information if you've been with us before. So during the presentation, you can, you'll show up as muted. You can unmute yourself either using the little microphone icon that you see here on the slide, or if you're on the phone, you'll need to press *6 to unmute yourself. If you are, oh yeah, that's a good reminder. If you are using your phone in addition to the online link, make sure you mute your computer audio so that you don't get feedback. And you can either use the chat feature to share your comments and questions, or you can raise your hand using the raise hand icon. The raised hand icon and opening the chat are in, if you're looking at your screen, there's the menu on the top of your screen, and there's a chat bubble and a reactions bubble. So if you click either of those, you can see the options for typing in or raising your hand to ask questions. And I just ask that you raise your hand if you want to ask a verbal question, because it shows me the order in which people have had thoughts come to them and wanted to speak. And so it just helps me make sure that everyone gets equal speaking time. Your interaction agreements, again, these are the same as we've always had, just looks a little different on the slide. Feel free to ask your comment or ask your questions along the way as we go. You don't need to stay, you don't need to wait until the end of each presentation to ask questions. Be polite and respectful of the other participants in the webinar, and please stay on topic. I know a lot of topics lead into other topics, and we can have those kind of like ongoing conversation, but be prepared that I may redirect us back to the topic at hand. Okay. All right, I'm going to go through the agenda. We're going to do welcome and introductions. Today, I'm just going to go down the list, call out your name, and have you introduce yourself and any organization that you're involved with. But I'm not going to do an icebreaker today because we have a lot of content to get through. So it'll just be your name and organization. I'll do a brief safety moment, and then we have an update from our Clean Energy Plan team about a community workshop that happened last week, I believe, the 15th. And then we have the Inflation Reduction Act, and then our main topic, or our largest topic today, is about transmission. One thing to note is that to get the slides online, in order for you to have them 24 hours before the meeting, they had to be posted obviously on Tuesday, and we made some slight updates. So these slides are not exactly the same as what you may have downloaded from our website. There's some title changes and I think a couple labeling or footnote changes on there. These updated slides will be on the website tomorrow. So just know that if you have a slightly different version, the version that you're seeing today will be online shortly. So I'm going to start with our introductions. When I call your name, please go ahead and introduce yourself and your organization. And I'm just going to start over here on the side with the people that I see in my meeting attendee list. I'll start. My name is Jessica Graber. I work for PGE in the Integrated Resource Planning team. And I will next go to Abe Abdallah.
Yeah, Abe Abdallah from Oregon Public Utility Commission.
Thank you. Andy Iden. Awesome. Angela Long.
Good morning, Angela Long from PGE. I use she, her pronouns.
Thank you. I have an Avery. I don't have a last name on this one.
This is Avery Dunn with Galehead Development.
JP Batmel.
Hi, this is JP Baumol with the Oregon Public Utility Commission. I work in the Energy Resource Planning Division.
Thank you. Ben Orndoff.
Hey there, Ben Orndoff, PGE.
Bill Henry.
This is Bill Henry, Pacific Ocean Energy Trust.
Thank you. Brett Green.
Good morning, Brett Green, PGE.
Thank you. Cassia Brockman.
Hi, Acacia Brockman, Oregon Public Utility Commission, Commission Advisor.
Thank you. Keisha, thank you. Kara Saylor. Welcome back to Kara. Corey Coopersmith.
Corey Coopersmith, Centuo Partners.
Thank you. Dina Dubson. Your last name is cut off. Is it Kelly?
Yes. Hi, Dina Dubson Kelly, NovaGen Consulting.
Great. Next, Eric Richardson.
Yeah, good morning. Eric Richardson, New Sun Energy.
How about Sarah Hall? Maybe I'll come back.
Hi,
Oh,
Sarah, sorry about that. Sarah Hall with OPUC staff. I'm Resource and Programs Development Manager.
thank you. Kim Herb.
Hi, Kim Herb with the Oregon PUC Utility Strategy and Planning Manager.
Jacob Goodspeed.
Hi, good morning. Jacob Goodspeed, PGE.
Thanks. Next, Jason Salmi-Klotz.
Good morning, everybody. Jason Salmi-Klotz, Portland General Electric. I work in the Regulatory Affairs Group.
Jeff Larson.
Hi, Jeff Larson, representing Apex Clean Energy.
Great, thank you. Next up, Jeff Wood.
Jeff Wood with PowerBridge, Independent Transmission.
Thank you. Joshua Bassifin.
Good morning, Joshua Bassifin with Climate Solutions.
Yeah. Next up, Kathy Moyd.
I'm following the IRP for the League of Women Voters, but I'm participating here as an individual.
Welcome. Lauren Kerr.
Good morning, Lauren Kerr, PGE.
Sorry, Lauren. I knew that as soon as I said it.
No worries.
Lynn Latendress.
Good morning, everyone. This is Lynn Latendress. I'm with PGE.
Thank you. Matt Kirsch.
Good morning. This is Matt, and I'm with Obsidian Renewables.
Thank you. Next up, Misty Gao. I'll come back to Misty. Nahit, are you here today? Looks like it. We'll come back to Nahit. How about Rhett Hurlis? Hurlis?
Yes, good morning. This is Rhett Hurlis with Absaroka Energy.
Thank you. Riley Peck?
Good morning, Riley Peck from Good Renewables.
Thank you. Rob Campbell?
Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Campbell. I'm an analyst on PGE's IRP team.
Robert Brown?
Hi, good morning. This is Robert Brown with PGE's IRP team as well.
And Samantha Thompson?
Samantha Thompson on the Distributed Resource Planning team, and my preferred pronouns are she, her.
Thank you. Nick Sayan?
Good morning, everyone. This is Nick with OPUC staff. I work on Sarah Hall's team. Thanks.
Yeah. I have a meeting guest. I can't tell if this is your first name or last. It just shows up as Guillermo to me.
Hello, yes, Guillermo Castillo here with the nonprofit Small Business Utility Advocates, SBWay.
Great, thank you. Seth Wiggins?
That's me. Hi, everyone. Seth Wiggins. I'm with the Integrated Resource Planning team at Portland General Electric.
Thank you. Shadia, would you like to go?
I am Shadia Dwedi, and I am with the at PGE, and I'm one of the project managers of our integrated resource planning team.
Thank you. Sean Foster?
Yeah, hi everybody. Sean Foster with Portland General Electric.
Thank you. Next up, Eric Shearman.
Eric Shireman, Oregon PSC staff.
Thank you. Shiraz Bengali.
Good morning, Shiraz Bengali with PG.
Thank you. And Jason Searman. Oh, I think he's on hold. I'll come back to him. Spencer Morsfelder. I always miss the R.
No problem. Spencer Morsfelder, Energy Trust of Oregon.
Thank you. Stephen Brown.
Good morning, PG.
Thank you. I have a meeting guest showing up as T. Bryan. Try to come back. Tomas Morrissey. Back to Tomas as well. How about Troy Gagliano?
Hi, everybody. This is Troy. I'm on PGE's Government Affairs team.
And Will Gerke.
Good morning. This is Will Gerke. My preferred pronouns are he, him, and I'm with Oregon Citizens Utility Board.
Great. So let's see. We missed. Oh, Erin, it looks like you joined us. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep, Erin Apperson, attorney for PGE.
Okay. And then Misty, I skipped over you. Would you like to introduce yourself? She might still be busy. How about Nahit?
Hey everyone, this is Nahit Shah. I'm an analyst with the IRP team at PGE.
Thank you. Okay, and it looked like Tomas was having trouble with his mute and unmute, so I'm gonna check with him, but I'm also going to move us into our safety moment, and you can all meet Tomas in a little bit. Okay, so today we just wanted to touch on some common home hazards. Make sure your home is safe and your families are safe, or your roommates or people that you live with or live near. So make sure that you learn the Heimlich maneuver. Keep people safe and yourself safe. There is a way to do the Heimlich on yourself if you are alone or live alone. And then you can always learn how to additionally do that on children and adults. Make sure you protect yourself from electrical shock. If you can, get your plugs and cords checked, and put those little plugs into your outlets to make sure there's no open outlets for people to stick their fingers into. Be careful of hot substances and steam. Teach children not to touch. Make sure you keep an eye on your pets if you have hot surfaces in your home. Make sure you keep firearms locked up and lock your ammunition in a separate location. And then don't leave young children or pets unattended if you're giving them a bath, and make sure that you have supervision in your backyard water spaces. It's a big thing in the summer because of COVID. A lot of people got backyard kiddie pools. So that's our safety moment. I'll pause here. Any questions before we move on? Okay, stay safe in your homes, please. All right, so we have Angela Long and Samantha Thompson here with us today. They're going to give a brief update on a community-focused workshop regarding the Clean Energy Plan. I think Angela might introduce the topic and then pass it over to Samantha. So whenever you're ready, go ahead and I'll advance the slides when you would like.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I just want to apologize for the bad lighting. I am at a conference today, so I'll only be able to join for the first part of this meeting, but feel free to follow up with Samantha or myself if you have any questions. Like I said earlier, my name is Angela Long. I am our Senior Manager of Strategy and Planning here at PGE. I lead our distribution system planning team, our distributed resource planning team, and our energy equity team. There's a lot of faces in the room, our names in the room that I've never met before. So just kind of quick intro into me. I have about 15 years of professional experience working in the private public sector in the energy sector, and have held a variety of roles in both consulting, government, and now I'm in the utility space. I have a background in environmental science, so I really have been doing this career for a very long time and kind of grew up here. The other thing that I want to say is that in terms of background and the work that we're doing here, we're really open to ideas on approach. So what Samantha will share today and what she'll be presenting is just kind of our beginning stage of where we're at with the Clean Energy Plan. We've been primarily focused on engaging a new group of stakeholders that haven't participated in the IRP, and we'll be looking to broaden that work in the coming months. Samantha?
Thanks, Angela. Good morning, everyone. Samantha Thompson. I am the Energy Equity Partner at Portland General Electric, and I work alongside, or my manager is Angela. So I'm on her team. I am about approaching 6 months, so I'm about 6 months old at PGE. However, my professional background is mostly from financial services. So I come from banking. My education background is mostly focused in Black studies and sociology. So, and what it means for me being an energy equity partner means that I do community engagement. I lead our community engagement efforts for the Clean Energy Plan, and alongside with Shadia for the DSP. And yeah, that's me in a nutshell. So I will go into our slide presentation to provide an update of our Clean Energy Plan kickoff that we had last Wednesday. Thank you, Jesse. So, as you see, these were some of the topics and highlights from our kickoff meeting. So the purpose of the Clean Energy Plan kickoff was to build awareness of the Clean Energy Plan, as this is a new filing for us. Our anticipated filing date is in March of 2023. And the audience, as Angela was speaking to, mostly included CBOs, which are community-based organizations, community service organizations, some government and municipalities folks. So that is the main targeted audience for our community workshops, also known as learning labs. Also in that meeting, we discussed the Clean Energy Plan. As like we said, this is new. And as we're building awareness, most often science is based on everything that we talk about. But for me and the work that I'm doing, climate change is really about a story about people. So we're trying to connect the dots. And it is in my role in PGE and others to focus on what we can do as a community, as innovators, and also identify some of the inequities in climate change. So we want to make sure that we're presenting stories and getting the Clean Energy Plan awareness out there so we can make climate change front and center, and you all can be a part of the public discourse. Also, what we talked about is how the CEP relates to the IRP, which you folks are familiar with, and the DSP. They're all kind of connected, but like I said, the Clean Energy Plan is new for us. Then, who you all are probably familiar with, Tomas, he provided a brief overview of the IRP to this audience who may not be familiar with the work of the IRP, but we just wanted to, once again, level set and connect the dots of how the IRP relates to the CEP and other plans. Then we provided an update and shared our community engagement strategy, which we filed last August, I believe on the 15th. Oh, wait, early September, sorry. We filed that. And the community engagement strategy just kind of, we wanted to acknowledge what was said from our environmental justice advocates, what was presented in the straw proposal, and which informed our engagement strategy. Some of the things and topics that were highlighted in that was uncovering a gap with more tribal engagement, addressing our gap in accessibility, meaning making our materials more accessible, like having transcripts, translating documents for future meetings, and making sure that we are providing inclusive and accessible materials and such. The next topic that we talked about, my colleague, was the CBIAG, which stands for the Community Benefits Advisory Group, which is being stood up right now. And this advisory group will provide kind of like a steering committee. How do I say this? We'll provide advisory to some of our other plans, and that may include the Clean Energy Plan. So stay on the lookout for that. This group will be mostly comprised of community-based organization members. And then lastly, at the end of our meeting, we designed a survey. We had about 10 questions on community engagement. And so as my role as leading the community engagement for the Clean Energy Plan, I wanted to know what they are thinking and what topics they would want covered. So we have a survey out there right now to help inform how we conduct our future learning labs. And I'll pause there, and if Angela, you have anything to add, I don't know, but I can pause there if there's any questions.
We do have a question in the chat, Samantha.
Oh, sure. Sorry, I can't see.
Do you want me to read it for you, or
yeah,
Marie, if you'd like to ask your question as well, I can repeat it. Or
hi,
okay,
yeah.
So, hi, Marie.
I just was wondering where you posted notice of the CEP kickoff meeting that you said was last week? I didn't see that come through the email list. So I was...
Yeah, so for our kickoff, we started with the community workshop members who were invited to our distributed system planning workshops. So that's where we started it with those folks, as this audience is more geared towards our non-technical venue. And this is for folks who mainly are community based organizations and environmental justice advocates. But if you would like to be on the distribution list, you can email cep@pgn.com.
Yeah, so Maria, the intent with the meeting was to bring in new partners that are not familiar with the IRP process in general. And as Samantha mentioned, more of a non-technical audience. So we did do an IRP 101 just to give them some background so that they feel comfortable participating in those meetings or in future meetings. So the intent is to figure out a way that we can merge the groups going forward, but we really want to lay the foundation and the groundwork needed for those new participants to be able to join this group, because from some of the feedback we've heard from our community-based organizations is that the IRP workshop is very technical. You know, a lot of the concepts have been going through this group for quite some time, and they're just not as familiar with the topics. And so they needed that background to participate effectively going forward. So we are looking at bringing both the groups together and having some common workshops.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Angela.
There's another question, Samantha, regarding the CBIAG group. I just want to, for those of you that may not be familiar with that group, it was required through HB 2021. That group is a group of advocates that represent most vulnerable communities, and the recruitment for that group, do we just send it through CEP website or the CEP CEP@pgn.com email, and then you'll route it to the right people, Samantha?
Yes, I can do that.
Okay.
Yes.
Kara, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks. I just had a follow-up on that. My understanding is that this is I think as you described it, a steering committee that's going to help kind of form the CBIAG as opposed to actually serving on the CBIAG. Is that accurate, first of all?
So there's two-part process, right, Angela? So right now they are standing it up, and then there'll be an ad hoc committee that is going to help recruit and for the actual CBIAG, which I believe is slated to hopefully launch in Q1 2023. So right now, yeah, they're like in phase one, which they're standing it up, and then they'll have this ad hoc group because we'll need our community environmental justice advocates to help us comprise of this group of, like what Angela said, who are going to represent communities that have been historically excluded from these spaces.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so the group, send the name along for us to pass along. But they've been working, so our DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion team within PGE has been working on establishing the CBIAG since, I would say, really April, working on what our engagement strategy would be. What does it look like in terms of the makeup of that group and like the level of effort and participation? They're pretty far along in terms of building the framework for that, and might already have started some of those ad hoc committee or steering committee meetings. So we'll try to get you connected with that group as soon as we possibly can. I don't know when they'll be meeting because, like Samantha said, they plan on kicking off the CBIAG at the beginning of next year.
And do you anticipate that there'll be overlap between the ad hoc group and the CBIAG, or do you anticipate that they'll be pretty separate groups?
think they'll be separate because I think the ad hoc group is, I believe it's just
There
for
might
this interim, right? And then they,
Well, there might be some people that serve on the ad hoc group that would
Oh.
be eligible to apply for, and I don't know if it's an application process or how they're gonna get the group together for the CBIAG, but there might be some overlap. The intent is to have environmental justice and community-based organizations represent the majority of the committee. So I think we have several community-based organizations that have already been participating in the ad hoc group, right, Samantha?
yeah, I think they met with the HB 2021 advocates.
Thanks. And then what would be helpful for her to provide to you in terms of background so that you can see kind of the full extent of her experience and expertise and
I think just an introduction, and we can get you connected to Stephen Nakana, who is our community and outreach manager, who's coordinating the CBIAG.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. So the next steps after our CEP kickoff meeting is that I'm going to set up meet and greets with some of our community partners. Like I mentioned, I'm newer to Portland General Electric, so I'm trying to connect and meet as many community partners. Also, I am scheduling our future community engagement meeting or making a plan on what that looks like. It'll be informed by our survey, which closes in a couple weeks. And also with creating topics for our future learning labs in regards to the clean energy plan. So a lot of this will be informed by the survey and meeting with folks. If you'd like more information or if you have questions, please email us at cep@pgn.com. And that's pretty much my updates. And I don't know if Angela, you have any last words?
Yeah, I just want to call out the learning labs and how we're defining them so this group is aware. The learning labs, like we mentioned earlier, just for non-technical audience, is to, bring them in, get them an understanding of key concepts that probably many of you in this room are very familiar with. Like, how does the CEP think about renewable and what does that word even mean? I mean, there'll be some kind of very foundational things that we'll touch on that. If there are topics of things that you'd recommend that we think about for those learning labs to help that group come along, we'd be open to that, and you can send those ideas to the email as well. We think of them as 101 meetings.
Looks like Joshua, do you have a question you'd like to ask?
Hi, yeah, Joshua Bassifin with Climate Solutions. Thanks for that update. For the learning labs, are you planning to have any guest speakers or partner with other types of organizations like advocacy groups or community-based organizations to work with you on those presentations?
I hope so. We probably are going to leverage, I call it the blueprint from the DSP. We did have a community serving organization that facilitated. So one of our goals is to have a hire a third party facilitator. We've asked in our survey for the DSP, we did interview and ask some of our community-based organizations if they would feel comfortable leading or facilitating some of our learning labs. And we actually got a response of some of them said no, but it could have just been based on time or I'm not sure any deeper, but it is something that we could look into.
I love that idea.
I would be open to that. I would love to have,
yeah,
a community-based
no,
organization lead.
Yeah, we had a community-based organization, Samantha, and a third-party facilitator, an industry expert that helped us with our we called them community-focused workshops in our distribution system plan, but it'd be the learning labs are kind of equivalent, right, Samantha? Where right now Samantha's asking them what topics they need more information on to participate effectively within the CEP. And so once we have that list, then we could identify organizations like you recommended, Joshua. I think that's a good idea.
Okay, great. And I'd be happy to recommend specific groups too, or specific folks who, have types of expertise you might be looking for some of those learning labs. So happy to take that offline.
Yeah, can you email Samantha and coordinate?
Yep, sure thing. Thanks.
Thanks. And so we have maybe like 1 more minute. Jake, do you have a quick question?
Yeah, thanks. Jake Stevens, Newson Energy. In reading the section 6 of HB 2021, it says in paragraph 2, the electric companies shall develop in consultation with the Community Benefits and Impacts Advisory Group a biennial report that assesses the community benefits and impacts of the electric company and shall file the biennial report with the Public Utility Commission. The report must include a description of the following: energy burden of disconnections for residential customers and small commercial customers, opportunities to increase contracting, actions within EJ communities within the service territory to improve resilience and to facilitate investments in distribution system and facilities to generate, and in several other items, including what investments have occurred, customer experiences, social, economic, environmental justice co-benefits from the investments, et cetera. We are 1 year since the passage of the bill, and so we haven't heard much about when this report will be done and what the plan is to actually complete the report and kind of the approach there. It's due about a year from now since the law took effect last September. So I was curious about that and talking about that and how you intend to sort of baseline the current status at the start of the passage of the law and so forth, and what may happen thereafter as these things get measured and observed.
Yeah, Jake, that's a great question, and that's one of the topics that we shared with our community focused or in our learning lab, to use Samantha's words, to give those that were participating in our learning lab an update on what we've been doing with the CBIAG to date. And so while Samantha and I do not lead that work, we would be more than happy to follow up with the individual that does that work to provide an update to this group. If that's something that, Jesse, we could get on the schedule and maybe have Stephen do in a following meeting. But I do, yes, you are correct, and that the CBIG will have a biannual report that does get submitted, and it is actually broader than the CEP. So if you are familiar with actual language for section 6, it covers a variety of things that are beyond just the CEP. While it does require the CBIG help ensure the equitable implementation of the community energy plan, it does look at workforce development, procurement strategies, disconnections. And so I think that group will have a broader perspective of kind of the work that we do here at PGE beyond the CEP. And so we'll definitely, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a compliance obligation, and it seems like a spectacular amount of work involved in data gathering and things like that. So just since we're a year out from the deadline, we're hoping that that would be sort of well on the rails, and curious to hear the status and
I wasn't aware that the section 6 had a deadline for that report, but we do have commission staff that I think is working on that here in the call. Maybe they could respond to that, but there was language within staff's guidance for the CEP that did say that CBIAG, there's no direct requirements in the proposed guidelines, the straw proposals that were issued, that they did see a connection between the CBIAG and the CEP. And so they have had numerous conversations within their workshops regarding that. But there's no regulatory compliance within the CEP right now that requires the report to be filed with the CEP. Is that what?
Well, it's a statutory compliance with the law. So the law requires it to occur biennially. And so that means, I think, every 2 years, if I remember my math correctly. And so 1 year in, that means we're 1 year away from you having to produce that in order to comply with the law. So that may or may not be overseen by the PUC and the nexus there. Certainly contemplate that further, but it is a statutory requirement of the electric companies.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll check with our legal team and make sure Stephen talks to them regarding the language and when that filing date is due. I think that's a really good flag, Jake. So I'll pass it along to Steve. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Samantha and Angela. It's nice to have you here.
Nice to meet
Bye.
everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the next topic is the Inflation Reduction Act. Seth Wiggins is going to present on this topic today, and whenever you're ready, I can advance the slides for you, Seth.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks all. So want to quickly just go over the Inflation Reduction Act. The law was passed in August at the federal level, and it has some pretty direct implications to IRP modeling. So if you could go to the first slide, please. Thank you. So looking at the Inflation Reduction Act, it's a big bill. There are many things included in it, but the relevant section to IRP modeling and CEP modeling is section 13701 out of, I don't know how many, where they outline a couple things. So a number of federal funding streams across a wide variety of topics in the industry, specifically looking at transportation electrification and other aspects that touch PGE. But most relevant to IRP modeling is the expansion of the availability of federal tax credits. So production tax credit and investment tax credit and what they're calling clean energy tax credit. So those are going to be applied, extended, and then applied to resources that we could potentially add to our system. And so this will have the most concrete and direct impact to the IRP. And we just want to quickly go over that, though I should say that there is additional guidance coming out from the Treasury and others based on what's in the law that will also affect the industry. And so we're watching it very closely as the provisions are developed and we get more information. And so the goal here is to incorporate by filing in March 31st of 2023, everything that we know about the Inflation Reduction Act should be in our filing. And so if you go to the next slide, please. We discuss how and where those changes are going to be applied. So ITC and the PTC, like I said, are extended through the end of 2024, then goes into a technology neutral tax credit, which looks very similar to the ITC and PTC. And so as you may have seen in the IRP, we look at proxy resources that potentially will be added to the system. And so the benefits or the reduction in costs that the tax credits provide will be incorporated into them. So where that happens in our modeling process is our revenue requirement model, Lucas, which calculates the fixed cost. Now, it is a variable cost or a variable benefit. That said, we assume for our proxy resources a specific and set capacity factor. Based on that capacity factor, we say, okay, in 2032 or whatever, a specific wind farm that we're looking at will have a capacity factor of say, or 30, 40%, something like that. And based off that, we can assume that the tax credits provide this many dollars in reduction of costs. And so that gets incorporated in the revenue requirement model, Lucas. And then those eventually go through, excuse me, to Rosie. Now, an important component of this is the planning horizon. And so an interesting thing about the extension of these credits is that they are going to be extended. The end date is either, the ladder of when the US power sector emits 75% less CO2 emissions from 2022 levels or 2032. So whichever comes last, that's when the tax credits will expire. So, that's an ambitious reduction of emissions that we hope will occur. But so let's assume that happens sooner. And so we're looking at a 2032 date. So that 2032 date is the start of construction, which means there's a number of years with Safe Harbor that could pass before the COD of the resource. And in the IRP, we look at the incremental resource additions. We look at the COD is what's important, because that's when the resource starts generating for us. And so, you know, if with a end of 2032 date, that means you're looking at a 2036, 2037-ish date for the COD for the IRP. And so what we're doing instead is that we're going to apply these tax credits out through the end of the planning horizon. So that's 2043. That's not explicitly in the law, depending on whether you project the reduction of that 75%. I see a question in the chat. Kind of. Yeah. So the later update. So it's the phase out of this of these tax credits will either be the later of end of 2032 or a reduction in the power sector of 75% of emissions relative to 2022 levels. Does that make sense? So if we, you know, somehow get to 2030 and we are fortunate enough to reduce those emissions down to, you know, 80% of 2022 levels, then the tax credits extend at the end of 2032. But if we don't, so if emissions only go down by 50%, say, by 2032, then those tax credits will be extended. So we are incorporating the benefits associated with tax credits out through the end of 2043 for a couple reasons. First off is we don't know about the when the power sector will emit less than that. The second reason is that the PTCs have been extended many, many times, and frequent IRP viewers know that the PTC extension has been a very hot topic because, you know, we've previously to August expected over the past couple of years that the PTCs were just about to expire. And so because of that, the resources that you would otherwise acquire, say, in future years, it made more economic sense to bring them up to the present. Now, because the PTCs and ITC have been extended so many times, we think, okay, by the end of 2036, it's reasonable to think that the credits, if they would be expiring, could be extended again. It's a high and surprising number of extensions since their inception in the, I think it was 70s or 80s. It's been expired by a number of times. And so we think it's reasonable to incorporate into models that extension, if it becomes relevant, will happen again. So uncertainty around the emission and the power sector is one. The possibility of extension is two. And then the third reason is kind of what I just mentioned about the bringing up of resource additions. So again, if they do expire at the end of 2036, if they're no longer available, well then if the model would otherwise select resources, say in 2038, well, the model's, you know, our models try to reduce costs. And so it will move those 2038 resource additions to 2036 to capture those PTCs. And so because the near term of the IRP and CEP is really the focus as to what resource additions the company is going to pursue, in the end of the planning horizon, it's a lot more informational. And so we don't want to have at the end of this, with so much uncertainty, any sort of unnatural moving forward of resource additions. We want to see a clean, more informational, less economic driven change in the back end of our model. So for those three reasons, we're applying these tax credits throughout the entire planning horizon. I hope that makes sense. Please let me know if it doesn't.
I think Jake might have a question,
Yep.
Unless that's your hand still up from earlier, Jake. I wasn't sure.
No, new question. Yeah, good overview, Seth. I think a couple things we agree with well in there, like for, the emissions off ramp, is probably not going to apply. So I think it's totally reasonable to assume that we won't hit that pre-2032. And I think the timelines for safe harbor make sense. I think one thing that jumped out to me in there that would be concerning, and I think what I heard you say is, we are going to sort of bump things forward to like 2036, if that would be inside the horizon. Or I wasn't sure that last comment, if you're saying, no, we're not going to do that, to make sure that things were being planned to be procured so they could comply with, be built before that safe harbor expired, which I would agree makes sense, including because I think contingencies, there's some over procurement that's going to be necessary to deal with sort of, failure rates and delays that are not controllable by anyone. But I think one of the things jumped out there that the PTC expires, and if it wouldn't exist in say 27 or 2037 or 2038, I think it really actually shines a light on the timing of the transmission upgrades required to, that you would be relying on in an IRP. So to the extent that, we keep talking about, the timelines of NEPA and permitting these transmission lines, but if you're assuming a transmission line would be online in 2035, that actually probably wouldn't be until 2040, then that would change what appropriate procurement strategies are, and making sure that that gets incorporated. I think we'll be talking about that a lot, but it would sort of down select things that would be relying on that, not just for the obvious transmission timeline reasons, but also then a double hit on the economics of a PTC not existing, if the transmission line didn't get built on time, which probably wouldn't be a risk I would take. So wanted to flag that as you guys are thinking about modeling it, but thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are making just to be clear, that we are making the assumption that the PTCs are going to be available after that safe harbor date. So we're saying 2039, say a project that we're looking at 2041, that's still going to have access to that technology tax credit even after that date. Okay. And so, yeah. But all your point about the transmission and the expiration, I mean, honestly, the economics aren't driving resource choices right now. It's carbon reduction. And so it's not going to change the resource choices, or the total quantities of resource choices that we make at the end of the planning horizon. It's all carbon reduction and reliability at that point. The resources, if you quintuple the price or have them, you're getting the same amount of resources required, because we have to maintain the system reliably. But okay. Your point about transmission completely applies regardless of the economics. And so it's going to be pretty critical that we're addressing that.
Okay. Well, I don't think we would agree with the extension of it indefinitely. There have been a lot of times it blocked off, and we've had the PGE take that position once before in December of 2015, and then the next week the Congress issued a phase out of the tax credits, for example. And so I think those should just reflect what the law is, which I think has been the PUC's policy on that, but point taken on the other parts. Thanks.
Understood. And just last comment is that's the biggest benefit of this change, is just the certainty, at least in the near term, that these PTCs will exist. We don't have to run a PTC extension scenario until the end of the life of or end of the planning horizon, and the certainty around this is an enormous benefit. I see another hand out there.
Yeah, Sergio?
Yes, thank you. This is Sergio Dueñas with the Western Energy Storage Task Force. So I have two questions. The first one is regarding solar. It says here that solar is now eligible for the PTC, but solar is also currently eligible under some conditions to the ITC as well. Is the model, basically, I guess my question is, when are the cost impacts visualized or realized by the model? Is it something that is an input? So prior to resource selection, the costs are already mitigated via the ITC or PTC? If that is the case, then those tax credits weren't optimized, right? You are making ex ante decision of solar will take the PTC or storage will have this amount of ITC. What are sort of those assumptions, particularly with regards to the adders that have to do with workforce, etc.? Is that something you guys have thought about? That basically is my question. And I saw you nodding to different points, so I think that you covered most of it with nodding, but yeah.
But not totally, and that's I appreciate you directing me there. So the tax credits, however applied, will depend on certain conditions, and some of those are well known today, and some of those still require additional guidance as to how they're implemented. I think the big concerns are the labor provisions associated with the tax credits, but there are others. So you could be below 100% on a project if you don't meet certain labor and other requirements, and then you could be above if you meet additional requirements, depending on where your project is sited and other factors as well. And so what we do in the IRP is we rely on these proxy resources. So, we have, take, for example, Southeast Washington wind. That's a general resource flavor, if you will, of basically what you would expect at the IRP 30,000 foot view, what you could expect to get over the next 20 years in Southeast Washington. We're not trying to say like, that Southeast Washington project is a specific project, but rather representative of the general characteristics you can get in terms of capacity factor, in terms of land costs, and all the characteristics. And so there's a wide variety of components that could go into that tax decision. Or that tax modeling. So you could say, based on a project in Southeast Washington, it would qualify for less or much more. And so what we're doing in the IRP, again, sticking with that proxy resource assumption, is that they all qualify for 100% of whatever's better. So ITC or PTC, or however they are defined, whichever gives them the greater benefit, they get 100%. Now, when we go out for an RFP, will a resource from Southeast Washington get exactly what we're saying? No, in the same way that the capacity factor they get will be different, or could be different. And all the other characteristics could be different. What we want is just the general reasonable level, and we can and have quibbled about whether we are accurate there, but we're just trying to get the general characteristics from that resource characterization and then bring that here. So you're absolutely right that there's significant variability in tax credit application. That said, we think it's reasonable just to say, okay, everybody gets 100%, and then in the RFP, when we go out, we will expect to see a lot of variation.
And just one quick thing, where does pumped storage fall in this? It is our reading that pumped storage has some set of incentives could be used for them, particularly now the ITC being completely tech neutral, but there are some elements of the storage ITC that are a bit more unclear if they could apply to pump hydro. But I know other load serving entities are also awaiting guidance, so I don't know if you guys had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm asking experts right now. I believe they get the ITC, and we're saying 100%. But tell you what, let me follow up with you and the rest of the group on the specific answer. But some experts in my chat are saying yes, ITC should apply. But yeah, we'll follow up with you on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. If you guys have any more questions about this topic, you can always reach us at our email. And if there's time at the end of the presentation and something pops up, or at the end of the meeting and something pops up, if there's time to take questions, we can take more questions then. For now, I'm going to move us on to the transmission topic. And I'll just, I'll introduce, so Jacob just turned his camera on. He'll be starting the presentation. Sean and Lynn are also part of our organization and will be adding to the presentation as it goes along. And I'm going to turn my camera off because I know this, as we get more cameras on, the quality of the video goes down. So I'll still be here moving the slides when you're ready, and I'll chime in when I see people raise their hand or chat. But other than that, it's all yours, Jake.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jesse. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jacob Goodspeed. I am on PGE's Renewable Initiatives team. So my role focuses a lot on PGE's 2030, 2035, 2040 decarbonization goals as specified by House Bill 2021. Specifically, it looks at, in partnership with the IRP, how do we drive our procurement strategy to make sure that we are acquiring the resources that we need to serve customers in 2030, 2035, and by Sean Foster, who leads our interconnection contract services team on the transmission side of our business. So Sean will walk us through PGE system, how that fits with other systems throughout the West on the transmission side. And I'm also joined by Lynn Latondras, who manages PGE's rights on the transmission system and can talk to us about what we're seeing from Bonneville Power Administration and how that fits with PGE strategy as we work to decarbonize. And I do just want to call out, as we walk through these slides, definitely hoping that this will be a discussion. So if you are seeing something that sparks questions or concerns or that we should double click on and talk more about, please don't hesitate to speak up or raise your hand or add that question to the chat. So with that, let's go ahead and move to slide 13, please, Jesse. So just to frame today's discussion, I think we'll certainly call back to this slide many times over the next couple hours of transmission discussion, but wanted to set the stage for how PGE has included transmission in the integrated resource plan, what we are seeing now as we work toward development of the 2023 IRP, and how we'll think about transmission on a forward-going basis as we think about the resources that we will need to serve customers reliably, affordably, and then in 2040 as part of a carbon-free system. And as part of that framing, we'll get into this throughout the day, but we'll have a discussion of PGE's physical transmission system, PGET. So that is in the area that we serve in Northwest Oregon. Those are the assets that transmit power across Portland Metro to Salem, to Hillsborough, to the different areas that we serve. We have long included that aspect of planning in the integrated resource plan. There will be a more distinct focus on how that drives our planning decisions. And we'll talk a little bit about how that reliability-based planning on system works and how we determine what projects are needed. And we'll go into a bit more detail on that. And I think, PGE is fairly uniquely situated in having a fairly small service area that is almost entirely surrounded by Bonneville Power Administration, a federal entity that operates a transmission system here in the West. And in past integrated resource plans, PGE has pointed heavily to transmission capacity that was available on BPA's system to bring resources from elsewhere in the West and deliver it to PGE's physical transmission assets so that we can take that to customers. I think moving to present day and how we're thinking about that now, I don't think it's a surprise to folks on the phone who have been following the transmission process in the West. We've been hearing from BPA as recently, even as last week, that they're viewing their transmission system as fully subscribed. And for additional capacity to be unlocked, significant upgrades are needed. So as we overlay that with our House Bill 2021 forecasted resource need on the energy side, we have been estimating somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 gigawatts of new resources to bring carbon-free power to our customers. And we are, again, overlaying that with a transmission system that is fully subscribed and in need of upgrades. And we are examining what options we have more holistically in this IRP. And that kind of moves us to that future column where we will have an increased focus on expanding our interface with BPA, unlocking what capacity is available, and then also examining in conjunction with more resources closer to home, interconnected to PGE system, what other options exist in the West, and how do we, in concert, kind of work as part of BPA's, balancing authority as we're within that, and then look for other options as well. So this is the framing. Like I said, we'll double click on each of these and can go into more detail throughout the next couple hours. But this is really the lens through which we'll talk about transmission today, really wanting to be in particular responsive to some of the questions that we've heard in the last few months, which is, how does PGE plan for the future within BPA? How do we plan so that our interface is ensuring sufficient capacity to serve reliably and affordably? Kathy, I think I saw your hand up just for a second. Did you have a question or something you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, I'm just wondering that PGE is forecasting 3 to 4 gigawatts of new resources. Is that just for PGE, or is that everything that currently would be using BPA?
Great question. So that is just PGE's initial forecast, and we will continue to refine that in the IRP that we file early in 2023. We'll have the actual number of resource procurement need that we're forecasting. But our initial sense and what we've shared publicly so far is that just PGE will likely need between 3 to 4 gigawatts of new resources to meet the 2030.
But are you also taking into account that you're not the only ones who are going to be asking for more transmission?
We are, yes. Looking forward to talking more about that as we go through the presentation today. We fully appreciate that we have a significant resource need. Our peers in Washington do, our peers elsewhere in the West do, and all of those entities are seeking transmission capacity both on BPA and elsewhere.
Yeah, sorry I didn't have a chance to go through the slides ahead of time.
No, I appreciate you teeing that up for us. That's exactly the question that we want to get to today.
Jake, just confirming what you just said, that 3 to 4 gigs is by 2030. Is that what you said?
That's exactly right, Jake. Yeah,
okay,
that's the 2030, 80% decarbonization. That's what that gets us to. And I think where you're kind of extrapolating is that there's an even more significant need to 2040, and we'll have to solve for that as well.
Yeah, but we agree with that ballpark. I appreciate you guys framing it that way. This is a good setup. Thanks.
Okay, let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please. So the way that we are planning to have transmission show up in the 2023 IRP is really 4 quadrants. And the way that we've set these up, as you can see, the y-axis runs from near-term need to items that are maybe more focused on the 2030 to 2040 targets as we decarbonize. And then the x-axis here on the left is more reliability driven. So, on the bottom left, we have near-term and reliability. And then as we move to the right, it's more focused on affordability, right? How do we ensure that we are procuring resources, including transmission resources if appropriate, for our customers that maximizes benefit and minimizes impact? So as we walk through each of these quadrants, I think that there will continue to be in the bottom left here, that PGE physical transmission planning component. Again, that's not new for us. That is something that has been in existence and has driven our resource planning for a long time. But you will see a more significant call out of that work, and specifically on the transmission system as we are teeing up projects and upgrades, how that flows through and what that enables and what that does. As we move up the y-axis, for things that are near term and very much 2030 and 2040 focused, it's addressing, BPA's statement last week that the transmission system is nearly fully subscribed. And we are looking at how do we increase the interface that PGE has today? How do we participate in expanding transmission availability on BPA's system? And really looking for kind of that historic provider role that BPA has had. How do we get everything that we can out of that? Again, knowing that we are not the only load serving entity that is kind of operating in both a decarbonization and a BPA transmission service framework. Moving right along the x-axis, so near term and affordability driven, we are continuing to assess what opportunities exist that would expand PGE's transmission reach. We'll talk a little bit about what PGE's transmission system looks like today, what our transmission rights footprint looks like today, and how we are thinking about potential expansions of that being examined in the IRP to determine whether they add a customer benefit, and if so, what that benefit is and what the impacts would be. And then finally, the top right quadrant is a pretty distinct focus on 2040, right? Knowing that we'll have nearer term projects that help connect the West, and BPA is working toward upgrades that they have outlined. But then, as Jake mentioned, there's also a 2040 goal where we will be operating a carbon-free system. Our peers in Washington will be working toward carbon-free under the Clean Energy Transformation Act. And there will likely need to be a next generation of transmission expansion. And how are we taking that into account? How are we working with our regional resource adequacy partners within Northern Grid, working with transmission developers, that sort of thing? So any initial questions as we talk about the framework through which we'll examine transmission in the IRP and how we'll talk through it today? Yeah, JP.
Hey, Jacob, thanks. This probably isn't for you, and we can address it later, but just how the data that you're sharing with us here and around the 3 to 4 gigawatts by 2030. Again, maybe for Seth later on, how that's reflected in the IRP's avoided costs. That'll be used for various things, whether it's PERPA, energy efficiency, demand response, kind of that capacity, and both the costs and the risk around transmission. So just kind of not necessarily for you, just putting out there as a placeholder, something we'll want to understand better. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. And I think that we'll have, as we think about kind of that bottom right box of where are we moving toward in the HB 2021 framework and what our regional peers are doing, I think we'll get a chance to chat about that. So maybe Seth and I can see if we are able to address the question at that time. Yeah, Jake.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, in some ways, this slide makes sense, but it also kind of feels a little bit like after the fact for probably some of the bigger things. And I guess, one of them is obviously like, what's the need and what's the evaluation of alternatives, situation, which is, I think, a big one. Another one, and obviously the timeline, I guess trying to understand how this would fit with, like, you're looking at your alternatives, and yeah, I kind of lost the thread of the rest of my question, but I'll follow back up. But I guess it seems like, what you need or whether you will need it interacts with things. Oh, and the other big thing missing is here is like, and I looked through the other slides, but I didn't really see is like, PGE has some of its own transmission rights already. And we don't see anything in this discussion so far about how PGE is going to reallocate the stuff that it already has and bring that to bear, which, just for context, like somebody bidding into an RFP with a new resource would essentially be excluded from being able to bring to bear on an RFP bid or something like that. How is that going to fit into this?
Yeah, good question. So maybe addressing the first question first, point taken on, how does this fit and kind of what is this compared to? I think, candidly, as we move into IRPs and CEPs that get toward the decarbonization targets, with the 2031 being essentially 7 years away now, we're taking an all of the above approach. So we are looking at kind of the 4 transmission boxes here for what could we do to get resources outside of Northwest Oregon to load, and even looking at, is there a situation where we have expanded BPA rights and something else? And then also there's going to be a really significant focus on how do we site more resources closer to home, right? HB 2021 talks about community-based renewables. I think that as we set those targets, that will be one of the comparators, is what could PGE's physical transmission assets or distribution system assets allow, and could that offset the need for transmission? So I don't think we are ruling anything out. We are very much looking to expand and take a maximalist view of everything on the table. How do we get to 2030 with a focus on affordability and a reliable service? And on the second, I think that that's something that we'll have to talk through. I think that Lynn will give us a little bit better picture of PGE's existing rights on the BPA system as we get to that point. I will say, generally the rights that we hold today are used for load service, especially during peak times. But let's double click on that. Let's talk a little bit more about it when we get to that. And I know Lynn will guide us through that discussion.
Yeah, thanks. And I know you've heard a lot from me about, well, we need to look at energy efficiency as sort of alternatives to transmission. But the other thing I've been thinking about the last few weeks since our last meeting is the ability to reduce the actual peak.
Well, we don't struggle through without you, but sometimes.
But energy efficiency, for example, decreasing the peak load, if the load, doesn't grow or is actually reduced, there's actually a transmission avoidance of actual new transmission, i.e. avoidance of billion-dollar 15-year projects. And I think that's a unique case scenario that needs to be drawn out in addition to like reducing the carbon demand. There's actually just meeting the peak and reducing the peak, which also changes that threshold in a useful way. And I think that's another key thing to incorporate. Thanks.
To jump in on that last point, Jake, I think you're absolutely right. To that end, we're evaluating the available energy efficiency beyond what's considered cost effective. And so when you're comparing that resource, so we're going all the way up to technical potential. So every single program we think that could be applied in our service territory, regardless of cost, that's going to be incorporated into the IRP. And so we'll cover later in this presentation, both what we think we can get out of the existing system, and then also these potential PG expansion options. But anything that we could do on our system is going to be relative to the costs and benefits associated with those excess. So you're absolutely right. That component, energy efficiency, and other DERs as well, will be evaluated under that context. So relative to the other options. And that's similar to JP's point as well. So if you're talking about like an avoided resource, if we say need a transmission expansion option to have an avoided resource, and then what, if we're looking at something on system or whatever other project that we're looking at, the comparison should be everything included in that next option that's coming to us. So JP, you're absolutely right. That should be incorporated in some way. That's a very difficult question, but something we will be thinking about pretty hard going forward. So absolutely won't be able to cover it in this presentation, but by the filing, or even after the filing, we're going to have to talk a long time about that.
So I think what I heard was when you evaluate whether EE is, for example, energy efficiency is cost effective, it will be in comparison with that next billion-dollar power line, for example, if that's the next incremental. You said next the other resource, but a resource includes getting it to you, right? So that would be the power plant, in Wyoming versus plus transmission line, that you'd have to build, et cetera. Okay, we agree with that, and we appreciate that.
Yeah, so it really is like if the only option, say in 2038, is to get that Wyoming wind option, like you have the cost of Wyoming wind, and then the associated transmission expansion cost should be layered upon that when comparing back to your energy efficiency or other DER evaluation. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So the cost you could avoid versus the cost of the other alternative, basically, right?
Yeah, and that's not a framework that we have right now, to JP's point, in other avenues, and so we'll have to think pretty hard about how to incorporate that.
Yeah,
because we've always, sorry to interrupt, but we've always just said, yeah, the thing you're avoiding is an on-system frame, and so if we're not looking at that resource as the other option, then it follows that you should be looking at something else, the costs and benefits associated with something else.
Yeah, well, we think that combined with timeline realism on transmission, which I'll let you get onto, and is the right context. So appreciate that. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, good questions. So slide 15 provides a little bit of an intro as to how PGE is situated in the West. So again, as we talk about PGE's physical transmission assets, that's everything within the blue bubble, which is PGE's balancing authority. Resources can be delivered to the edge of that bubble, and then PGE's transmission system delivers them to customers where they're needed, where that power is needed. As you can see, BPA, the balancing authority that BPA operates, is that red bubble that kind of fully encompasses PGE here. PGE also has connections to PacifiCorp's west side of their system. So we very much kind of exist in an interconnected system with our neighbors in the West. As you can see in the bullet points on the left side of the slide here, pretty significant interconnection capacity with BPA today, right around 4,500 megawatts. That's the kind of interchange of what can be delivered from BPA's balancing authority, that red bubble, into PGE's balancing authority, that blue bubble. And also a smaller connection with PacifiCorp West, right around 300 to 400 megawatts. It's primarily used for EIM participation. Also calling out, we don't necessarily have it on the graphic here, but some interconnections to public utility districts and public power providers in the Portland metropolitan area. And then as you look at some of the blue lines within BPA's system, primarily the California-Oregon intertie down to Captain Jack and Malin, PGE is a partial owner of those paths as well. And then the final portion of kind of the transmission picture here that I'll call out is up in the top right. That is Montana. So PGE does hold some rights on the Colstrip transmission project that comes out of Colstrip, Montana. And the path there is that it comes from Colstrip and then would need to come through BPA to get to PGE. And, again, to go back to the framing of the conversation for today, we'll talk about what's inside of that blue bubble of PGE transmission assets and how are we planning to make sure that that is ready for 2030 and 2040. How are we working to make sure that, to the extent that BPA has said that everything that they own in that red bubble is nearly fully subscribed and will need upgrades, how are we doing our part to enable that so that resources can pass through that to PGE? And then we're also talking about what else would exist? Would there be opportunities for PGE to have other transmission connections that would supplement what we see here today? Okay, let's go to slide 16. This is a little bit different view. This is PGE's current transmission assets. So these are things that PGE has ownership of.
Jake,
yeah, Jake.
Can I ask a quick question about the prior slide?
Yeah.
Couple small quick ones. So that circle, the gray circle where you go from your Montana rights to BPA, how are you getting it through there? Is that through long-term firm or short-term firm, or like what's getting you across that gap?
I'll field that question. So I'm Lynn Latondras. I manage our transmission portfolio on behalf of PGE. We hold long-term firm transmission rights, both on the CTS, which is what PGET owns, as well as the Montana intertie, which gets us then to the Garrison interconnection with BPA. And then we hold long-term firm point-to-point from Garrison to PGE's load service territory.
One friendly amendment to that, Lynn. The rights on the Montana intertie aren't equal to what you would consider long-term firm if you were to go out and try and reserve it on Oasis. It's a legacy contract between the Colstrip transmission system owners and the Bonneville Power Administration, which will be up for renewal in 27. But essentially that's how it's treated as is long-term firm rights. They're essentially just capacity rights, shared capacity rights on that what Montana refers to as the Eastern Intertie.
And how many, thanks, that helps, and that makes sense. So how many megawatts is that Bonneville garrison to PGE system?
If we can hold that question for the BPA discussion, I have it noted on a slide what our portfolio of rights are across BPA.
Okay, great. And I was also curious about like this Redmond point there, that PGE has rights to get to and from Redmond, which doesn't entirely make sense to me given the geographies, unless it's a
bit of legacy that dates back to the 60s when the Pelton Round Butte facility was built. I don't know all the history because a lot of it has been lost with the people who no longer are even probably still with us, unfortunately. But that used to be a line that was owned by Bonneville. At some point back in the 60s, Bonneville sold what is known as the Redmond to Round Butte line to PGE as part of the development of the Pelton Round Butte facility. And so PGE physically owns a 230 kV line that runs from the Round Butte substation right there at the Round Butte hydro facility down to Redmond. And then BPA owns the Redmond substation. And then immediately it goes into PAC's Central Oregon load pocket. And so Bonneville's only presence there is the substation, as I understand. But I could be wrong. I'm not the expert on Bonneville and PAC system over in that territory. But so we own the line that runs from Round Butte to Redmond, and any arrangements to get to or from Redmond would have to interface with Bonneville at least to get to the Round Butte to Redmond line.
So, yeah, and maybe this is a question for a later slide, but what is the capacity of that line and those transfer rights, assuming that you can get into Redmond through some other means? That's a 230.
Off the top of my head, it's in the neighborhood of about 300 and something change megawatts. Your challenge is then trying to get to PG's load is the Bethel to Round Butte line, which has been fully subscribed for 60 years. Essentially. So Round Butte as a result is not an acceptable delivery point because there's no way to get from Round Butte west to load.
There's no way relative to your discretionary. I mean, that's assuming that's all filled up with hydro from the Round Butte dam.
Yeah, correct. The TTC on that line is lower than the nameplate capacity of the Pelton Round Butte facility, which is a designated network resource, which is encumbered. It encumbers that capacity.
Right, but that's a dispatchable resource, right? So if you just don't run it, then variable resources could come through there, right?
I'm certainly not the expert on Pelton Round Butte. I do know that while it's not Runner River, it's pretty darn close to Runner River. There's an endangered species, bull trout, in that area. And so inflow and outflow have to be within a certain percentage of each other to the project. And spilling water is not an option because it puts too much dissolved, either it's oxygen or nitrogen or whatever it is, into the water, which is harmful to the fish. So there is some ponding ability of it. I don't know how much, but it's not something that they can pond for a tremendous amount of time before it starts running afoul of the endangered species requirements of the hydro license.
Thanks.
Will, did I see your hand up?
Yes, hi, this is Will Gerke from Oregon Cub. I had a question about the south of Alston line. Can you just provide background on what it is? I'm pretty familiar with BPA transmission. What does it mean that PG owns 26% of it? Does that mean that, when that facility was built, PGE rate based it and it's been paid off over time and it's depreciated? What are the obligations on that? I just would I don't get a lot of chance to ask a transmission expert what's going on there. I'm just trying to understand that section a little bit. I've heard for a while that there's congestion there. Just trying to get a broad understanding there.
There is, and Lynn will speak to it a little bit later on as to how it impacts importing to PGE over Bonneville system. But south of Alston, it's a collection of, I think it's 9 lines, maybe 7. I can't remember off the top of my head. PGE owns 2, Bonneville owns 1, and Pacificor actually own a couple of smaller lines. Pacificor shares like 6% or something like that. And so with transmission paths, essentially what you're doing is you're essentially trying to find a way to better optimize the use of the system for typically reliability purposes. And so back in, I think it was 2009, PGE, BPA, and Pacificor entered into what's known as the South of Alston Agreement, which essentially allocates out the capacity over all of those lines. And so PGE's share is sort of bounded because of the way the contract is written at 775 megawatts. And Bonneville has the lion's share, and then Pacificor has a smaller amount. It varies between seasons, summer and winter. The 26% is the summer, or excuse me, the wintertime value. In the summertime, it's less. It's about 22, I think, percent. And then there are some clauses in there where if something happens to increase the south of Alston capacity above a certain point, then capacities would then get reallocated. So PGE's 2 lines that are a part of it are what are known as, I think it's currently Trojan to St. Mary's and Trojan to Rivergate. There is a project in PGE's local transmission plan called the Harborton Reliability Plan that will end up re-terminating those at a rebuilt Harborton substation just north of the St. John's Bridge in Portland. And to bring some additional reliability to that north and west side area of PGE's system. But those are PGE's 2 lines. Bonneville's line is the big 500 kV line that runs from what's known as Alston, hence the name south of Alston, to their Keeler substation in the Hillsborough area.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
Yeah, good question, Will. And I'll admit, I don't know off the top of my head how south of Alston has historically shown up in PGE's retail rates, but happy to follow up on that and get a sense for what the level of depreciation on that asset is and kind of how it's been treated in the past.
Both of those lines are pretty old. I want to say they're 30 to 35 years old, I think, but they are part of considered the transmission rate base.
Yeah, and I think, Jesse, if we go to slide 16, that shows as we kind of move from PGE's rights, this is PGE's transmission physical ownership. So the 2 Trojan lines that Sean mentioned, we see kind of stretch up to the north and west of our service area. And then, as you can see, PGE's transmission for owned lines is very much kind of limited and on a north-south axis within the state. And not pictured, but mentioned are the Colstrip transmission rights that run from the Colstrip project in Montana west. Jake, do you have something? And you may be on mute here.
Yeah, just a quick thanks follow up on the south of Alston. That was a great summary. I think, well, from a rates perspective, right, and everybody else's context, south of Alston is a bottleneck on anything and everything from everywhere, period. Like if you want to build something near Olympia, if you want to build something near Eugene, near in Southern Oregon, Southeastern Oregon, Washington, it's everywhere. So in terms of priorities and resources and whether that's a good use of ratepayer money, that's a top priority and resource. And we would encourage it as you guys plan your resources to be treated as such. And we've talked with Bonneville about that. And but in terms of ideas to solve problems, right? You guys have a slice of whatever that capacity allocation is. If we file a transmission request on the Bonneville system and it runs into, if we're lucky, the only problem is south of Alston, right? Bonneville, to get to the PGE system, like bpat.pge or what Pearl or something, that Bonneville can't really allocate us your capacity. So right now we've got a little bit of a contractual bottleneck that you guys could actually bring to bear to somebody. And I think there's a really powerful discussion area of how can that be treated and managed, including, how if we had a right that was, as we have in the past, only a south of Alston issue, should that be modeled as curtailed or not, or exposed to those curtailments if you guys actually control that extra capacity. So I would encourage that to be explored further and, internally and with Bonneville, and happy to discuss offline.
Yeah, I'll just offer, Jake, that, and then I think we probably need to move forward with the presentation just from a timing perspective. But I'll just offer that, that's one of the considerations that from PG's perspective, we're going to have to look at all these older agreements that are in place because they were built around how we used to operate the system with thermals. And the recognition that the transition to a decarbonized resource mix is going to require changes in that. And so south of Alston is definitely a challenge. It's we look at it every single day. You talked about it being a challenge to get anywhere. I mean, it's a challenge to get from Montana. It even impacts coming from southeastern Oregon, right? So it is definitely an encumbrance. And at the north end of it for PGE, we have thermal resources, and obviously we're going to have to start using those facilities less as we approach 2030 and beyond. And so as part of that, we're going to have to bring Bonneville and Pacific Core back to the table to reassess that agreement. And what Bonneville also accepts as an acceptable delivery point from their system to ours, because that's another challenge that we face with the south of Alston cut plane.
This is Randy Hardy. Can I make an observation, please?
Sure, Randy.
Hello. Yeah, to continue this, but put a little different spin on it. Frankly, the Bonneville transmission planners, and I'm sure you all are aware of this as well, are more worried about Raver Paul than about south of Alston. Because when Centralia 2 goes out, retires in 2025, the south of Alston problem doesn't go away, but it gets significantly reduced. You have 670 megawatts of thermal power that no longer is trying to get south in the summer evenings. But that will shift the congestion issue, as I understand it, to Raver Paul. And in the 2021 cluster study, Raver Paul was the huge constraint. It wasn't this time around, but the loadings were within 100 megawatts of exceeding its TTC. So there's a whole number of questions, and of which I'm sure you're aware. But looking at the effect of Centralia 2's retirement on the south of Alston / Raver Paul problem is a critical part of how you address this.
Yeah, Randy. Point well taken, Randy. And that is, all the planners that I've been talking to for the last several years have all been, before Centralia 1 shut down. That was something that everybody brought up, that Raver Paul is going to become an issue. It doesn't discount the fact that the south of Alston capacity limit is what it is, and it is commercially constrained. There is no more capacity to be sold over that. So we're going to have to address both of them. But you're right in that Raver Paul, with Centralia shutting down, becomes yet another thing that we're going to have to work with Bonneville to address for the region.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, really good questions. Let's take a quick detour and talk about PGE's transmission system, kind of physical ownership within our service area, and then we're going to have an in-depth discussion on some of this BPA planning, what we're hearing from BPA. And for folks who are a little bit newer to the discussion, we're going to introduce for some of the constraints that we're talking about, south of Alston, Raver Paul, west of Cascade South. We'll talk about exactly what that is, how we're seeing that develop over the next decade or so, and how we're approaching that kind of in collaboration with stakeholders in the region and with Bonneville's planning team. So Jesse, let's go ahead and go to slide 17, and I will go ahead and hand this off to Sean to talk through PGE's transmission system, reliability study, reliability upgrades, that sort of thing. Sean?
Let me make sure my mic's on so I can talk to everybody. Because we're framing this from the lens of the IRP and what we're looking to do in the IRP. It's helpful to talk about what PGE has done historically and what probably necessarily hasn't shown up in the IRPs of the past. And so the next couple of slides will just speak to that. So if we go to the next slide, please. And so I think everybody's probably familiar with this map. It's our service territory. We put this up here just primarily to demonstrate, that the majority of the transmission system that PGE owns is within our retail service territory in the northern Willamette Valley. We did see on the previous slide one of the previous slides where we do have some facilities that extend and reach out beyond our service territory, but the amount of that is fairly limited, and so the bulk of our transmission system is in fact within our service territory. And when you look at it compared to other transmission providers, it's not relatively huge. Next slide, please. And so what does transmission planning look like for PGE in the past? Primarily, PGE has taken a reliability first lens as we've done our local transmission planning over the last 15 years or so. Well, I should say last 10 years or so. And so what does that look like for PGE? So every year as a FERC jurisdictional transmission provider, we have to meet NERC reliability and other standards, and one of those is to perform an annual system assessment, a TPL planning assessment, where we have to essentially ensure that our transmission system will meet the load service and commercial requirements and obligations that we have. And so, how our transmission planners do this is they essentially model our system in a various set of seasons using what are called cases. And these cases are intended to model electron flows on the system and stress the system and identify if there are going to be problems based on load forecasts. And so for the NERC TPL studies, the transmission planning reliability studies that we do, that's using a 1 in 3 case from PG's corporate load forecasting group. And so here's an example of the cases that PGE used in the 2021 TPL case. And so we're running cases to test for extreme scenarios in the summer, winter, and then also spring, because in spring we found that we're starting to see some challenges actually in the south to north direction, as it's still cold up in the Pacific Northwest and beyond up into Canada. And there is plenty of what we're assuming to be solar generation coming from California and the desert Southwest. Next slide. And with that said, while they haven't necessarily shown up in the IRP because they've been more focused on local reliability, our transmission plan does have a number of projects that are being developed and have been being developed to ensure safe and reliable delivery of power. I'll take note of the top project that you see on the list. That is the Horizon to Keeler number 2 line. That's a new connection to the Bonneville system in the Hillsborough area. We talked earlier about the interface capacity with BPA and how we're so heavily reliant on it. That's an example of a project that will end up increasing or adding incremental capacity to the interface with Bonneville. A lot of these projects are intended to again ensure that we have a safe and reliable project. I also want to draw everybody's attention to the bottom project on this list. For those who are familiar with the most recent Bonneville TCEP report that just came out, a month and a half or so ago, they refer to something in there referred to as the north of Sherwood issue that needs to be mitigated on PGE system. And so this project, while it's not an actual project, it's a concept currently identified in PGE's most recent long-term transmission plan was something that PG already had identified as something that PG needs to explore for the long-term reliability of the local load service on the west side of our service territory. And so I'm just calling these out to highlight that, while Bonneville identified several issues with BPA system in their TSEP, most of those we already have either identified ourselves or are starting down the path of trying to figure out a way to mitigate those contingencies. And Jake, I see your hand up. Nope. Okay.
Yeah.
No question. Go ahead. Sorry.
This is a great slide, and I appreciate it. And I think I'll highlight for others. Yeah, the crux right now in that 2022 T7 that just came out, most of that conditional firm, a lot of it's just Bonneville doesn't know when the PGE side will be done, right? And therefore they're conditional firm awards, essentially. So this is really important. I'm glad to see all this outlined. I'm curious about the interface with Bonneville on the schedule of these and how kind of what has been done or was or wasn't reflected in that last TSEP versus how soon you will, because Bonneville constantly rollingly reviews, the awards and offers. So as these things get firm schedules or get committed to or put on the books, Bonneville can actually unlock, firm transmission and so forth, and then inform their studies. And that also becomes really important for the next study, which they're obviously started on already, as to when they'll know what that is, because that'll then backflow into what the report says and what they can or can't award. So I think, A, this is fantastic, but B, the limits of that interface and the timeline of that interface were really important to what Bonneville studies end up showing. That's one comment I'm interested on. And then also, it'd be great maybe in a future one to then do like a, what's the permitting reality overlay of these projects, because we'll talk about the Bonneville ones, which aren't realistic. You guys don't have a lot of federal land necessarily on system and have different rights, in a single county and so forth for permits. But very curious, how sort of timeline realistic these are and when they will be formally committed to as relates, back to the Bonneville interface question. So.
I think maybe I can address it in this way. All but the bottom project right now are committed projects those dates are the dates that we're driving to. So of special note, I forgot, I was remiss in not highlighting the third project where it's identified as Pearl BPA Sherwood. For PGE, it's known as the Pearl Sherwood McLaughlin project. That's a joint project we've been talking with Bonneville now about, and our transmission planners have been coordinating with Bonneville now for well over a year, even before all the requests were into their last TSEP process. And so everything except for the one on the bottom is a committed project for PGE at this point. Those are the target dates for those projects. That last one, to your last point, Jake, about permitting challenges, that last one is going to be, if we have to proceed with that project, is going to be a challenge. One can only imagine trying to site a new 230 kV line between Sherwood and the Hillsborough area. That's some land, some nice rolling hills that the folks that live there aren't necessarily going to want to see a new line in. And so, that just illustrates the permitting challenges that do exist with the development of transmission. I see another hand up.
So I have the phone number ending 6542 is the person with their hand up. And we're going to take this question and then we're going to pass it over to Lynn to do her slides.
Yeah.
While that person's coming in, can you comment on the load in the prior slide and how, like, what Bonneville has seen and what's kind of, I don't know if you guys are filing Bonneville load requests or kind of how much of that is publicly visible load queue versus not and so forth. Obviously that interacts with the BPA studies too. And so we've seen cases like on the Pacificor system where they have 1,000 megs in Prineville that's in their load queue, but they don't use it in interconnection or transmission studies, and Bonneville doesn't technically know it exists, and that affects studies.
Yeah, I mean, the load scenario is one where PGE is a transmission provider. We have to serve all of our transmission customers. which, including PGE's load serving entity. And so those customers who are network transmission customers have to submit on an annual basis annual designated network load and designated network resource data, and then also update as more of that happens. And so, all of our transmission customers do that. PGE then has to roll that up to WEC for WEC's anchor data set and other purposes. And then that's typically what Bonneville uses when they're evaluating all the various loads in their service territory. To make sure that there's some consistency is what is sent to WEC.
So let's try, I just enabled your microphone. So let's try the person on 6542 again and see if we can hear you.
I think that's Randy. Randy, are you still on?
I see, he's got his mic enabled, but I see that it's
Randy,
muted for him.
star 6 might work.
Yeah, try star 6. Okay, let's.
If you want to, I can.
Hello.
That helps.
There we go.
Hey,
There's
Randy, we can
Randy.
hear you.
Anyway, what I wanted to say is that Pearl Sherwood capacity upgrade, as I'm sure you realize, is extremely important. I would just urge you and Bonneville to try to reach a conclusion on this as rapidly as possible. And let me use the example of the Cross Cascade North improvement that Bonneville, by installing series caps on Schultz-Raber, turned 500 megawatts of TTC into 1,600 megawatts of ATC once they got all the loadings figured out from the 2021 cluster study. I don't know whether that's possible here, but I think it is highly likely that you're going to have more than the 500 once you complete the Pearl Sherwood McLaughlin upgrade, that you're going to have more than the 500 megawatts of TTC increase that's identified and that Bonneville identified in the 2021 cluster study. And that's stuff that would become available in 2027 per your own graph. So say you get 1,000 megawatts or 1,200 instead of 500. That's a very significant near-term increase. Everything else with Bonneville is 2030 or beyond. This is 2027. So I would just urge you to get to yes on that with Bonneville in terms of who's going to pay for what's going to be done, and how you're going to allocate any TTC/ATC that comes out of that, because it's in a time frame that actually is relevant to meeting your 2030, Oregon decarbonization goals, which most of the other Bonneville projects are not. So end of speech, but you need to give that one as high a priority, I think, as any other one on this list because of that reason.
Yeah, Randy, thanks for the comment. I can say that the way the project is structured is both Bonneville and PGE are essentially just performing work on each of their own facilities to advance the project. And the reason why it's necessary is it essentially reduces an N-1 condition, or reduces an N-1 to an N-1 condition. And so it increases the reliability and therefore allows for more reliable operation of the system in that area. And so from PGE's perspective, PGE's advancing the project to move forward, and we're coordinating with Bonneville and essentially it's just both entities doing work on their own system collectively to further the same goal.
Understood, but is it so? I've had a lot of discussions, less with you all than with Bonneville, and each time I talk to you or to Bonneville, the finger gets pointed at the other entity relative to, well, I'm waiting for him or her or whatever. You know, whatever you need to do, I'll go back and bang on Jeff Cook and the Bonneville people some more. But we need to get that to a point where Bonneville can say, okay, this for sure is going to be done, just like it did with the Raber-Schultz SCPs on Cross Cascade North. So it can then put it into its plan and announce that this is going to be done by 2027, both its work and PGE's work, whatever we need to do to get them comfortable enough to do that. And then they can identify what the loadings are from the 2021 and 2022 cluster study, and we'll know whether we've got just 500 megawatts or we've got something significantly more.
Yeah, and so I think we're running short on time, so I think we need to advance to the next section and let Lynn talk. Randy, I'm happy to talk more with you and respond about that here in the near future if that's helpful.
Sure. Well, yeah, enough said for now.
Happy to join on it.
Thank you.
Synthesizing that into like a key action item, the timing.
Jake, I'm gonna ask you to follow up
One
with
sentence, please.
Sean a little bit later because Lynn does have some pretty important slides to get to, and I don't want to cut off an important point, but she's going to answer some of your previous questions. So I'm gonna.
PGE has that conversation with Bonneville relative to the current study is probably the single most
Jake,
important thing you can
I'm
do.
gonna. I'm going.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm gonna move on. Okay, Lynn, go ahead. I'll advance when you're ready. And Kara, I do see your question in the chat, and I'll follow up with you at the end of the meeting about that.
Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. We're going to get into the nitty-gritties about Bonneville and their system. They have about 18 flow gates that they currently manage, and I would note that in the 2022 TSET, they identified the need to establish a few additional flow gates and are unable to offer up conditional firm service until such flow gates are created so that they can create an ATC, TTC associated with those. So that's also an additional bottleneck to them being able to offer incremental amounts of conditional firm to the extent certain requests hit the newly identified need for flow gates. As noted previously, and Jake spoke to this, Jake Stevens did, that nearly all generation that's located anywhere in the Pacific Northwest hits the south of Alston constraint. And pretty much it's zero, like there's zero ATC across that flow gate, and it's a commercially constrained issue today that's part and parcel to what needs to be resolved in order for us to meet our 2021 decarb goals. As has been mentioned a number of times, last week Bonneville held a meeting talking about ATC, and the system itself is nearly fully subscribed across a majority of the flow gates. And we'll go to the next slide. This is PGE's current portfolio of transmission rights across BPA's system. A majority of those rights are point-to-point. A couple are legacy agreements associated with previously held rights pre-First Order 888 and 889. And Jake, to your earlier question about our rights on the coal strip system, if you look in the kind of middle to upper right-hand portion, that is a demonstration of what our rights are. We have 300 and some megawatts associated with the coal strip system itself, 280 on the Montana intertie, and 270 across BPA system to PGE's load pocket. We also hold some point-to-point rights on PGE's transmission system and interface with PAC, and we talked to that earlier. It's EIM related that we use it for. There's a few other PPA type arrangements that also rely on those rights. And in addition to that, we hold some point-to-point rights on the intertie. The contracts that we have internal to PGE's system is a NITS-based transmission service, network integration transmission service, and it's solely used for load service purposes. Jake, I see that you came on.
Yeah, Lynn, can I add one thing? I think this is just so valuable. I wanted, for folks who are maybe newer to thinking about transmission, the question may come up of why does, we've heard a couple times, anything new hits south of Alston. And if we go back to slide 22 for a second, we see that south of Alston is a relatively, it's a flow gate that's just kind of northwest of Portland. I just want to call out that although contractually we think of a path as from point A to point B, if we are bringing a resource home from Southeast Washington, for example, it doesn't necessarily just flow through the gorge into Portland. That's the contract path, but the actual physics of it means that that energy flows on the path of least resistance. So it could actually fan out throughout the entire Pacific Northwest shown on Bonneville system. And that's why we talk about kind of anything new hitting south of Austin or hitting Raver Paul up closer to the Puget Sound, just because of the way that the energy flows and not necessarily contractual constraints, which are related but a little bit different. So I just wanted to flag that for folks who are thinking about what these constraints mean and how the flow gates work.
And to that point, BPA posts tools on their website that help assess what those estimated flows may be across those different flow gates so that you can get an idea as to how that translates into the ATC that would be needed to grant a particular transmission service request or a TSR. Okay, next slide. So Bonneville's currently posted available transfer capability or ATC. As you can see, is pretty fully subscribed. This doesn't take into consideration the pending queue, which is demonstrated on the next slide, but the three critical flow gates that are most impacted when trying to get a transmission service request to PGE service territory is south of Alston, Cross Cascades South, and Raver Paul. So next slide. If you look at the ATC minus the pending queue, it's a pretty drastic negative situation, very deficit across the region. And this is why Bonneville in their last meeting last week indicated that they're nearly fully subscribed. Even if only a handful of the pending queue requests go forward and commit to taking transmission, it's highly likely that any of the existing ATC would be easily utilized. And we're in a situation where all of the upgrades that have been identified need to be completed in order for the region to ensure reliable load service on a forward-looking basis. I think it's important to note the last TSEP, Bonneville had over 300 requests that were submitted and 24,000 megawatts worth of new transmission requests. All of that is factored into this, as this was a snapshot of their ATC minus pending queue from August of 2022. Next slide.
So just confirming, that's before or after the new TSEP study window deadline that was in late August?
After.
So, okay, thank you.
Slide 26, I went and I pulled a bunch of information from all of the prior TSEPs and did an analysis of requests that were pointed at Portland General Electric and tried to correlate them to the resource zones that we're looking at associated with portfolio construction in the IRP. And this is a synopsis of that information. There are confirmed requests, which means that BPA has granted transmission service, and there are those that are still in study status. Those that are still in study status prior to 2022's TSEP results, all are ones that Bonneville has indicated are available to receive conditional firm service. In the 2022 TSEP results, Bonneville had indicated a number of flow gates that needed to be created before they could award conditional firm service, and also pointed to the completion of a couple of projects, notably on the south of Alston cut plain as well as the Raver Paul, needed to be completed prior to them being able to grant additional conditional firm service. To earlier points that have been made, we believe also that the 2030 energization date associated with Bonneville's upgrades that have been identified is a very optimistic energization date, given that permitting right-of-way environmental studies have yet to be initiated, as well as then all the supply chain related issues that we've been seeing and inflation. Any questions on this particular slide? Jake?
Yeah, just a quick note. I think Christmas Valley probably should just be relabeled as Central Oregon. I think all of those TSRs are from a broader area, I guess, than that for whatever that's worth.
Understood. We were trying to correlate it to what we're identifying as our resource portfolio, so and overlaying the transmission on top of that.
Right, but yeah, there's only like 190 megawatts that can actually get out of the Fort Rock Christmas Valley area without building a new transmission line, and the rest of that is Central Oregon. And then there's also a bunch more in the study in that region as well that probably is, since you have a mix of study and confirm, that would add. Thanks.
Yep. So additionally, I'd like to point out that the 2022 TCEP, we had 2,200 megawatts of offshore wind that are pointed at PGE. Bonneville indicated that they're capable of awarding 80 megawatts of conditional firm, and the remainder of that would be subject to the upgrades identified in that cluster study report. Next slide. Jacob.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Lynn. Let's just pause here. Any additional questions? We've moved through a little bit of a combination of PGE system, PGET physical assets, BPA rights, and kind of how those two concepts fit together. Any additional kind of thoughts on that, or questions, concerns before we move on to zooming out a little bit, thinking more kind of future looking? How do we think about 2030? How do we think about 2040? Yeah, Jake.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate Lynn acknowledging that the BPA timelines, and I feel like maybe somewhere in the backup slides that I saw that you guys had Bonneville's in-service dates listed out, and acknowledging that that didn't have the full timelines. Like reframing that a little bit, you guys are obviously most focused on the Big Eddy Chamawa 500 upgrade. That is a new 500 line through Spotted Owl territory on the north side of Mount Hood, with a whole new right of way that'll have to be procured. And so, and having talked to the engineers that put that in there, there is zero permitting timeline in there. So that schedule was 3 to 4 years of design plus 4 to 5 years of construction equals 2030, with zero permitting or NEPA whatsoever. So that 2030 schedule date is probably more like and Bonneville is prohibited under its federal tariff from doing NEPA until design is fully completed. So they're not actually even allowed to move forward for 4 years if they actually do that with starting that process, which means they would be starting NEPA in maybe 2026 or so. And so that timeline needs a plus 5 to 15 years, until that is, and I think 10 years is probably a optimistic number there. So as you guys are looking at your timelines and the viability and all these avoided trade-offs and everything, that really seems like a 2040, realistically. And so we'll flag that, and hopefully that flows into that. Thanks.
I would just say, Jake, BPA, or not BPA, but PG recognizes some of those challenges with respect to work that's either been done or not done in regard to those projects, and so we have similar thoughts about it. So point well taken. Yeah, and I appreciate that. I just obviously whatever goes in the IRP model, we want to make sure we're not arguing later about the model still said 2030. To get us past that certain point. I think that brick wall is essentially defined, at this point. And so that would be 2040 would be something we would think would be realistic, if slightly optimistic, thanks. And the other thing I'll point out, for you guys probably know this, but maybe the rest of the community doesn't. When I was discussing with Bonneville, they're like, and we have to figure out when Portland General would like to take an outage relative to a 230 line, and the substations, right? And we might need a year for that. So it's really will be a brand new separate power line entirely, and lots of fun stuff. Thanks.
Yeah, point well taken, Jake. Thank you. Shadia, I saw you turn your camera on. Did you have something?
Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. Okay, let's move on. Again, let's zoom out a little bit. Let's think about, as we go back to those 4 quadrants that we had at the beginning of the presentation, where we talked about PGE transmission, Bonneville transmission, the way those fit together. Let's go ahead and move to the right side of those 4 quadrants now and talk a little bit about regional transmission options, how we think about 2030, what PGE's place in the region is kind of the entire West moves toward a decarbonized system. I think it will be a little bit more of a discussion that's at the intersection of generation resource planning and transmission resource planning. I do want to caveat that we're not talking about any specific projects today. I think that we'll have an opportunity to get into more details in the future, but rather wanted to tee up how PGE would think about and potentially analyze additional transmission options in the 23 IRP and what those comparators might be as we think about what represents kind of least risk, least cost, maximum benefit for customers. So if we move to slide 28, just a quick summary of PGE's clean energy targets. You may have seen these before in the last few months. They talk a bit about what PGE's done as we've reduced our carbon emissions level from baseline to where we were in 2021 and things that we are planning. I think that I just wanted to show this slide to call out a couple of framing elements. One is, I think folks on this call are probably more well-versed on exactly what Oregon's decarbonization requirements are, but did just want to call out again that the 80% reduction by 2030 that we're working toward is the absence of emissions. So we'll need to offset carbon emitting resources via other non-carbon emitting resources. And we'll be moving from a baseline that's just over 8 million metric tons of carbon equivalent to 1.62 metric tons of carbon equivalent. So as we talk about the clean energy volumes that we are estimating, that's what's behind that. That takes us from the 8.1 to the 1.62. And we'll need to overlay transmission options to both be able to add new non-emitting resources within PGE's service area, and also to potentially get new resources to PGE's service area from elsewhere. So let's go ahead and move to slide 29. This is just, if we zoom out a little bit from Oregon and what PGE's requirement is, this is what we're seeing in the West. And, you know, I think Washington, through the Clean Energy Transformation Act, California through Senate Bill 100, are both pretty well known that they are moving toward a carbon-free system. I think largely what we're finding is the entire West has carbon reduction goals, right? As we think about Nevada as a carbon-free system in the next couple decades, New Mexico, you know, and even a couple of the states, like we see Wyoming here, which has no official state policy, it is served by a utility that has carbon reduction goals in the other states that they serve. So I think that what we're finding is that PGE is accelerating toward 2030 and 2040 in concert with other load-serving entities and investor-owned utilities in the West, who are kind of all moving toward a carbon-free system. And, you know, I think that that holds as we move forward and start to look at what a more regional picture looks like. Okay, let's go ahead and move to the next one, please, Jesse. So what does that mean? You know, is all of these different states in green and kind of light blue there have carbon reduction goals. We took a look at the most recent integrated resource plan or equivalent for the utilities that serve those states. And what we found is that there is significant variable energy resource development, and there is potentially fairly significant climate zone diversity as we think about what's showing up and where. And, you know, these graphics are not intended to represent specific projects, but rather are indicative of the different resource types and climate zones. But just ballpark, what we've seen from our peer utilities is that we expect anywhere 5 to 10 gigawatts to be added in the Pacific Northwest, in the Rocky Mountain West, and in the Desert Southwest. And then California revised downward its carbon targets earlier this year and would have utilities procuring 25 plus gigawatts of new resources, new non-emitting resources by 2032. So I think, you know, as we step outside of kind of PGE's resource planning and Oregon's House Bill 2021 targets, I think that we are seeing that there is a significant opportunity for potential collaboration and partnership throughout the West. As we see new projects come online, we see utilities adding carbon-free resources to serve load, and we are seeing diversity and either loosely correlated or uncorrelated production between these different climate zones that exist. Yeah, Kathy.
Does the Pacific Northwest 6 gigawatts include the floating offshore wind? Which is supposed to be.
Good question. It likely does. I think that this is a little bit more resource agnostic. The 6 gigawatts is from what PGE, Puget Sound Energy, Avista, all outlined in their most recent IRP as resource need. So I think that each of those utilities has looked at or is looking at floating offshore as a potential proxy resource. But this for now is showing, maybe the better way to think about this is like what's needed over the next decade and what have utilities earmarked will be served by variable.
I missed that big deed in the title. I apologize. My sister lives right outside Tampa, Florida. So I'm a little distracted right now. So I apologize if some of my questions are a little off the wall because I'm only half paying attention.
Kathy, great question. And yes, hopefully safety for your sister and her family.
Yeah, it's coming in south of her, so she's probably going to get a lot of rain, but not too much wind.
Jake, what do you have?
Well, and I guess before I say this, I'll say I really appreciate the quality of the slides and what you guys have brought today. On this one, I appreciate also the sort of regional reality perspective, but a couple of points. I mean, first, I think your point, like this is what the last IRP said. Well, pretty much everybody's last IRP is irrelevant or categorically wrong. You just said you need 3 to 4 gigs by 2030, which doesn't leave a lot of room in that 6 gigawatt number for Puget, which also needs probably 6,000 megawatts. So I think the reframe around that, and then meanwhile, I think my understanding is that major industrial loads in the Northwest, I think maybe just on the public power system are supposed to be another 6,000 megawatts, which if you divide by a 30% capacity factor means they just need 18,000 megawatts of new renewables. Which kind of leads me to one of my other big concerns and questions, which is, this sort of presents therefore we can all, can support each other. But I think the reality is more of like the competition of transmission resources and generators. You're going to be competing with Puget for, does somebody like NewSun or Avangrid want to sell to you guys versus Puget? And you both have different regulatory obligations. And candidly, CETA is a little bit stricter. And so far, sounds like, their PUC has taken a harder line on the consequences for failure. So, you're going to be having to out hustle and out compete with limited supply in the market. How are you guys thinking about that and approaching that? And now you're also competing with industrial customers, and we see this as a new reality, in a good way from a supplier standpoint. But it seems like there's some compliance challenges that are many layers bigger than kind of what's presented here. And your ability to get to anybody else here on this map requires a new 15-year transmission line project if you're lucky. So any comments on that?
I think that's right. I think getting to your first point that directionally there's probably an even more anxiety-inducing version of this where we think about, what did folks say in 2021 versus what are they going to say in 2023, and all of these numbers potentially double. And I think that we are very much aware of the other side of that coin of we think and we want to explore opportunities for inter-regional collaboration, but we also do understand that as we think about the footprint and the scale that we've been talking about for the last hour, 90 minutes or so, a lot of it is Washington and Oregon and a little bit of Western Idaho. And to the extent that we may need 3 to 4 gigawatts on our system, Puget, Jake, you cited they may need up to 6 gigawatts on their system. Those constraints on the transmission side are very much real, and they'll very much kind of impact that ability to get that done. And then also there may be, generation constraints that you're absolutely right that as we look to procure, we know that our peers will be looking to procure also the best kind of nearest to home transmission accessible resources as well. So how we've been thinking about this and what we're wanting to explore in this IRP is, as we think about these as kind of distinct geographic groupings, right? The Pacific Northwest, the Rocky Mountain West, the Desert Southwest, and California, whether there is the potential on a longer term horizon to alleviate a little bit of that demand that's driven by needing to comply with the decarbonization requirements by allowing for kind of inter-regional transmission that would kind of leverage that climate zone diversity. And I think if we go to the next slide, we're kind of highlighting, I'll caveat before we get too far down the road on this. PGE does not own a stake in any of these. This is just what's publicly available, currently permitted and being built from the transmission perspective. And I think if we overlay this with that previous slide, what we're seeing is transmission development that was permitted 10, 15 years ago, or that was conceptualized 10, 15 years ago, is really looking to tie together those resource zones. And I think that the ability to meet those decarbonization requirements will really depend on continued expansion of the transmission system, right? I think we are seeing constraints here in the Pacific Northwest. I know that other load serving entities in other places similarly are seeing a need to expand transmission. And we are examining whether, I think that it's far from a specific project or a specific idea for how we would do this, but examining whether this type of interregional transmission could find kind of collaboration within that competitive landscape.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I would just say, first of all, none of those transmission projects help you an inch without New Bonneville transmission over the Cascades, right? Which are all 15-year projects. I'll highlight, I think, number 4 there, the SWIP. We saw a presentation in Alderbrook recently that pointed out that project was conceptualized in the 70s or maybe the 50s for that thing to come into reality. And therefore, resource plans that sort of assume benefits from things that, can't exist without that BPA 15-year NEPA process, or that some, purport to be even farther behind that, to us just seems sort of categorically inappropriate to how we're going to get to 2040, and want to make sure we're avoiding that dead end. Also on the prior slide, I guess one thing that I think needs to be thought a lot about is you guys are competing, for different suppliers is also like, the commercial terms available from, folks in terms of whether people even want to do business with PGE if they have other options, and kind of what those contract terms and sort of the friendliness of doing business. I think for the regulators thinking about, what does the world look like? And I would close that out with saying, I think you outlined about 1,000 megawatts of transmission, kind of confirmed or in study to your system. Well, a couple of redirects and PGE is now at the back of the line behind everything in the entire queue. If somebody just decides, we'd rather do business with Puget or send it to Mid-C, which wouldn't be really hard to do. And I think that sort of reality overlay as relates how urgent your procurement needs are and how desirable and what the contingencies and overlays, I think, is sort of a critical failure risk that should be taken seriously. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Okay, let's go to 32. I think that this kind of draws this conversation together. We noted at the early part of this presentation that PGE is really moving into a planning environment where we have an all of the above approach, right? As we kind of zoom out to the entire West, we see our service area in the northern Willamette Valley. We, again, expect to add significant, more local, hyper-local, closer to home resources as we kind of work to comply with House Bill 2021 and think about how community-based renewable energy could accelerate our decarbonization story. As we look in green here is kind of the historic footprint within PGE's IRP modeling, right? That's Southeast Washington wind, Central Oregon solar. As we think about batteries, we are, again, as part of an all of the above approach, looking at whether transmission could serve as a capacity expansion option. And, we are thinking about if PGE's transmission network, either from a physical assets or a rights perspective, were to be expanded, what could that potentially reach? What could that potentially bring home? Is there a benefit associated with that? And I think, candidly, and getting to your point, Jake, an examination of what's available as we think about BPA's system, as we think about our own system, and we think about what else is going on in the West. Is there an opportunity to kind of maximize value? Is there an opportunity to supplement what is kind of happening within BPA system? And is there a path worth exploring from a resource planning capacity expansion perspective? And again, I don't want to kind of overstate for this meeting today whether there's a specific project or area that PG is looking at. I think that we just want to outline the ways in which we will be thinking about this in the IRP. And I think that if there is something that looks like a potentially attractive possibility, that'll be a conversation that we'll have in the coming months as we think about our IRP portfolios and how those come together. Okay,
Jake?
let's go ahead and move to yeah.
Oh, well, Jake Stevens, I see your hand is up and I'm not
Sorry
sure if that's a
for-
new question. Okay. All right. All right. So next slide. Is that good?
Yes, please.
Cool.
Just wanted to end on a call out here. Really interesting study by the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab a couple months ago that called out as the country works to decarbonize, and as we are seeing an acceleration in the adoption of clean resources, specifically after the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the transmission projects that can pull together different regions of the country has potentially significant value. So this map that we're looking at here shows some of the transmission value connecting the Pacific Northwest and the Intermountain West, similarly with California and the Desert Southwest. This is limited just to relieving congestion and facilitating like market access. But our hypothesis that we'll continue to explore in the IRP is that these benefits would even compound if we think about the resources we will need to add specifically as PGE to meet the 2030, 2035, 2040 requirements. And then similarly, what our peers are going to be adding and what value that access might bring if we are able to have a transmission system that enables a more collaborative approach. Okay, so if there are no other questions, I say let's leave it there for how is PGE thinking about this nearer term and more toward a affordability, reliability story perspective. And I'll hand it back to Sean to talk a little bit more about, if we think back to that 4 quadrants graphic that we started with, the top right, where we're thinking on a 2040 time scale and thinking about what's possible and what emphasizes reliability and affordability. Sean?
Yeah, thanks. Next slide. And so we just wanted to round this out by having a conversation about what are the activities that are currently happening in the regional landscape, and then also the transmission planning landscape as it relates to the rest of the West. And so, of course, I think everybody understands, PGE is a participant in the Western EIM operated by the California ISO. A couple of years ago, there was a recent consolidation of 2 transmission planning regions from that both sort of overlaid one another, generally speaking, Columbia Grid and Northern Tier Transmission Group into what has become Northern Grid. And then at the start of this last cycle, the second cycle, the footprint expanded even longer, even though it's not reflected on this image, with the addition of NV Energy into the mix. The Western Power Pool's Resource Adequacy Program, RAP, recently just filed its tariff with FERC to start the path down to a binding program that participants will have obligations to, on a forward-looking basis, show that they are adequate with respect to enough resources to serve their load. And there are going to be, real penalties associated with if members, participants are unable to demonstrate their compliance with that. And, with Northern Grid, I want to call out that we're in the first year of the biennial cycle. And, a few months ago, FERC announced their transmission planning notice of public rulemaking that will significantly reform the transmission planning process. One of the key elements of that reform is that it's going to most likely elongate the time horizon, which is something that definitely seems warranted considering how long it actually takes to get steel in the ground on transmission projects. In light of that, and actually before that happened, actually back around the January timeframe, PGE reached out to Bonneville and PacifiCorp because the recognition that the existing Order 1000 transmission planning process wasn't going to meet the needs of House Bill 2021, with the recognition that, we're going to need to bring on significant amounts of new resources. While the numbers to get to 2030 are staggering, we also have to be thinking about 2040 and how do we achieve that. And so that really ties to how Jake described it, sort of an all of the above strategy, because, while yes, we need to focus on 2030, if we hope to meet 2040, we have to be doing that work now as well. And so with that, PGE was able to partner with most of the members of Northern Grid, not all of them, but most of them, to push forward a couple of other studies that will help inform the region's needs. One of them is a 2030 extreme weather scenario. And our idea behind that was, frankly, we've seen some pretty extreme weather here in our service territory over just the last 2 years, and our impression is that is going to continue to happen, and so we need to start planning for the system with that recognition in mind. And so it's going to contemplate things like severe ice storms and extreme fires where, multiple lines are being taken out across the region, heat domes and all of the rest. And then second, there is a 20-year time horizon study that is happening, as well, contemplating the impacts of CETA, contemplating the impacts of HB 2021, that will be used to inform the region with respect to what we think we're probably going to need to see from a transmission perspective. And so those reports the study scopes are still in development of those. They're being run by the Western Power Pool, which is, of course, where the planning activities, the engineering activities for Northern Grid are actually housed. They're lodged at the Western Power Pool. And we should see those reports. The 2030 extreme weather report should be available, I think Q2 of next year. And the 20-year time horizon planning study should be available late Q3 or start of Q4 of next year as well. Next slide.
Sean, could
Kathy,
I ask that you have, excuse me, I'm tripping over my words. Could I ask that you see Kathy's hand and see if she has a question to ask?
Yeah, I'm sorry I missed that, Kathy. I apologize.
It's okay. First of all, I do want to congratulate you on the 2030 extreme climate. That's something that I've been kind of banging on you guys for for many of these meetings, that the last 2 years indicate that we cannot use 30 years of historical data to figure out what's going to happen in 2030. So thank you for that. My actual planned question was, would having a regional transmission organization help, hurt, or not make any difference?
It's too hard for PGE as a single entity to answer that question. There will be some benefit in optimization of the dispatch of resources to optimize use of the system, and so I don't think there's any denying that is something that typically comes from, and that's why generally markets get stood up. To understand what that is would require essentially modeling of the entire system, and understanding who would participate, who wouldn't participate. And anybody who's participated in any of these market development conversations One of the things that I think if you understand really, really well is at the end of the day, governance and who's in charge of deciding who pays what or who pays for what is the hard thing to overcome. And there are challenges with the concept of expanding the California ISO because of current governance there, even though that there's traction in doing so. There are unknowns with respect to what an SPP run market would look like and what the governance would look like there as well. And so, I say that to say, in order to model that, you have to know who is in the market, who is out of the market, and what is the footprint of the market, including what resources are in the market. And there's too much that's still unsettled in the development of both of those, EDAM and Markets Plus that are happening right now, to, I think, really effectively model it by PG alone. So I think there may be some benefits, but we shouldn't overstate the benefits either. There are going to be costs that come with joining a market, and different entities are going to be situated differently, where they end up paying more to be a participant in the market, but they're sort of forced to because market liquidity in the bilateral market potentially dries up. And then there'll be winners in that marketplace as well. And so, there's a lot to be yet determined with respect to what the costs and benefits are of a Western market.
Thank you.
And so I think I already talked about it, but just to drive the point home, PG continues to engage in all those conversations. We were a founding member and one of the driving forces behind Northern Grid and a couple of studies I mentioned. This is the current footprint of Northern Grid, and the projects you see highlighted in there are the projects that have been highlighted as the regionally significant projects currently proposed in the Northern Grid planning process. I think a lot of people know this, but Northern Grid is comprised of 14 members, Bonneville being one, 7 IOUs, and 6 municipally owned public utilities as well. The process continues. The second biennial report will be available by the end of next year. I anticipate also that we'll have some additional clarity in the FERC transmission planning NOPR process. I'm not necessarily sure that we'll be at implementation time by then. These sort of landmark orders, which this is shaping up to be, often face a request for rehearing at FERC, and sometimes they can face legal challenges as well. And then there will be an implementation window beyond that, where each of the planning regions will have an obligation to update their tariffs. And for Northern Grid, that's essentially going to mean having to go back and redo the regional planning organization's planning agreement between all of its members and redo the tariff as well. And so, my anticipation is we won't have an implementation window by next year. But that being said, that's why we're undertaking these efforts to at least try and understand with the policy goals of our state and others, how we can at least try and plan to identify what those needs are going to be. I see a question.
Yeah, this is Marie Barlow with New Sun. Do you know, is there some way that we can subscribe to an email list to follow what Northern Grid is going to be doing to comply with that order?
Yeah. If you're not already, I would recommend getting in contact with the Western Power Pool, facilitates and administers the planning process. And if not, I can get you the contact information as well. And all the meetings, the planning meetings are open meetings that any stakeholder can attend and participate in and provide input into. And so absolutely. And so I can make sure you get that contact information.
Thank you.
So Marie and Sean, I will connect you after this meeting, so you have each other's contact information. Any
Thank
other
you.
questions for Sean here?
I'll just add as we're wrapping up, the transmission section, thank you everyone for the really great discussion today. I think that this is helpful for us as we think about next steps, which will be an expanded focus on transmission and transmission options in our 2023 IRP. We're grateful for the opportunity to tee this up today and for the feedback. If you have any additional questions or want to continue to talk about this between now and the next meeting, please don't hesitate to reach out. Yeah, Kim, your hands up.
Thanks, Jake. I just to sort of going back to how you articulated that, we should be expecting more analysis around the role of transmission and evaluating different resource options. Will you be able to provide, I don't know, more context around what that evaluation would entail and how we can sort of dig into that and think about what that methodology and the modeling looks like?
Yeah, I think that we absolutely can. I think that it will generally follow the discussion that we had here today, which is, PGE system, BPA system, and any potential other projects that might fit into that. I think that I don't want to speak out of turn. So Seth, Jesse, correct me if this is off base, but I think that in either the October or November roundtable, we can double click and get a little bit more detailed as to, yes, this will show up in the IRP, but specifically how and kind of how we should think about that as a stakeholder group, and we'll kind of get feedback on the process then. Is
Okay,
that
great? Yes, I think that's great. I'll look forward to it in the future roundtables.
awesome? Okay, thank you so much.
So, because we have a minute, I see, Marie, you have your hand up, but I also want to make sure that we get back to Jake's point during right before Lynn's discussion and make sure that we covered the point that you wanted to cover since we have the time. Would you like to, Jake Stevens, would you like to reiterate what you were saying when I moved us along?
I think Jake had to drop off the call.
Oh, okay. We'll follow up with him. Personally, unless Seth, did you want to say anything for the benefit of the group about what he was chatting about?
No, I think it's just articulating the need for more information on how we're working with BPA to characterize the existing system and what we can and can't get out of it. And so we'll follow up with him, but I don't think there's a need for further discussion with this group, other just to emphasize that this will be critical in the next IRP.
Okay, thanks. Marie, did you have a question that we can answer? I saw your hand go back down.
Yeah,
okay.
That was a legacy hand.
Okay, legacy hand. Great. Anybody else before I kind of go over our next steps? Okay. So we recorded today's meeting. It'll go on our website in at least 1 week from today. And then our October roundtable date was scheduled for October 20th, but we're going to push it back about a week, and you'll get an email from me with that new date and meeting information pretty shortly before the week's over. And then we have the rest of the meeting dates, November 16th and December 15th on the calendar. So you'll get more information about that, but just so you have those. And the last slide here is how to get in contact with us if you have any additional questions or comments that you'd like us to know. Oh, and I see maybe, is that Kathy? Maybe?
No, I didn't have anything.
Okay, I saw your hand go up. But so if there's no more questions,
I touched it accidentally. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. Happens to people all the time. So I think that's it for us. If we have no more questions, then I'll go ahead and end the meeting, and I'll be in touch via email about the upcoming meetings. Thanks, everybody.